Thank you very much for that fine speech. We're now going to be turning back to paper speakers. Speaking next in proposition is Stephen Lynch. Stephen Lynch is the Executive Director of the Eastern Powerhouse, Director at Beijing to Britain, and Chairman of the IOD China Group. He is also the former Managing Director of the British Chamber of Commerce in China. He has previously lived for 12 years in China. Mr. Lynch, you have the ears of the House.
So, firstly, let me start. This is an incredibly stressful speech because it's an incredibly stressful topic. I wanted to define hypocrisy, and I spent most of yesterday trying to define hypocrisy, but I'm also going to be a bit personal here. I'm also going through a stressful time in my life. I've got a 2-year-old daughter. The terrible twos are a very real thing. So yesterday, I was working at home trying to define hypocrisy while I put Peppa Pig on for my 2-year-old daughter, and I thought, hold on a second. There is too much Peppa Pig. We need to be a bit more productive with my daughter. So I thought, no, we're going to switch that one off. And we're going to do some productive. We're going to read some books. We're going to play some games. She had an absolute meltdown. It was pretty difficult as a parent. But I got her to bed and I was absolutely exhausted. So I thought, I'm going to write my speech. And I thought, actually, I'm just going to put the football on. So I sat in front of the couch. I watched the Liverpool game. I watched the Arsenal game. I watched the highlights. And basically, all of my productive time was gone. And I thought, I might finally have realised what hypocrisy actually is. So I'm going to confess, I am a hypocrite. And can everyone look to their left? Look to your right? Yeah, you're all hypocritical too, I'm sorry to say. But it's all about scale. And don't worry, that doesn't make you bad people. And so I'm going to scale this up. Let's look at our countries. Let's look at the West. We are indeed hypocritical. But that doesn't mean we're bad countries. That doesn't make us inherently wrong. What does that make us? It makes us human. So I'm going to categorically prove tonight that the West is hypocritical towards China. And my central argument will be that hypocrisy is inherent from the West towards China. But most importantly, that does absolutely not justify China's actions. And that hypocrisy does not invalidate the criticism itself. It's true, as Alessio mentioned, we have an incredibly problematic colonial and imperial legacy. And I think we need to acknowledge that. That's fundamentally important because we must be self-aware. We must be self-reflective of our past. Our past has shaped the global power dynamics we live today. Our past has shaped the geopolitical situation we find ourselves in today. And our past has shaped China's perception to that geopolitical order. Now, some people are not going to like this, but we do need to have empathy towards China. We need to have empathy towards their history, their rich history, their history of colonial occupation, to their history of internal chaos, to their history of years of striving for sovereignty. That will explain the situation of where China is today and their viewpoint of the world. That does not justify their actions and that does not justify them undermining the international orders. That's very, very critical. So I think it is clear we are guilty of hypocrisy and we are guilty of double standards. But that does not make the standards themselves wrong. I think, as a global order, we can hold China and other countries accountable for their actions while accepting our past failures. Hypocrisy is a challenge to overcome, not a reason to remain silent. So, I am here to talk about hypocrisy, and where better to start than the West's colonial imperial legacy. The Western nations, particularly in Europe, particularly the UK, come on guys, we did it the best, has an incredibly problematic legacy. We have cultural erasures across the world, horrific exploitation, horrific human rights abuses. Now, it is easier, it's a bit more palatable just to say colonialism. But the truth of the matter is, all the countries criticizing China committed far larger atrocities on a far wider scale during our colonial periods. Now, I can see the opposition scribbling notes. I'm just parroting back Chinese propaganda. Well, let me reframe that. What do we actually want from the PRC? What does the West actually want from China? What are the goalposts? Because we continuously keep moving them. In many ways, the West will not be happy with China until China stops being China. The West's expectation of China lacks complete clarity. For instance, on one hand, we say we need to follow all the World Trade Organization orders, principles. Yet, on the other, we have an incumbent president in the US whose favorite word is tariffs. Love tariffs, better than love. Tariffs on the Chinese. I'm doing Donald Trump, that wasn't clear. So, countries are continuously being asked to reduce their oversupply in China while we continuously buy their cheap goods. We say we need to go green. Morally, as a planet, we need to push towards net zero, but not with China at the center of that. We need to work together on global healthcare. Well, we just had a global pandemic and we didn't work with China. Fundamentally, the West is fragmented. Fundamentally, we don't have a coherent strategy because we have different interests. And the only thing that unites us is not our policies, it's our professed values. And it's these values that we use to scrutinize China. So I don't think it's productive to use my time to just talk about the colonial atrocities. There are many. But all of these directly undermine the moral authority that we have to criticize China. And it rings very hollow. It rings very hollow in countries that we previously colonially occupied, especially those in the global south, where see China as more of an equitable partner. A bit of audience participation here, so help me out. Has anyone heard of FOCAC? One. Okay, so FOCAC, that's pretty interesting. FOCAC is the China-Africa Summit. I was in Beijing about 3 or 4 months ago when this took place. There was 51 heads of state in China having bilateral and multilateral meetings with Xi Jinping. In what other country could that be convened? In what other country would want to convene? In China, we just accept no. What I'm trying to say is 1 in 8 people live in the global West. 7 in 8 don't. 7 billion people on this planet have a very different perspective of China as to how we think they should have an opinion of China. China's not a dirty word in many parts of this planet. In fact, it's seen as a partner. So we're not living in colonial era. We're living in a time where China is redefining the global order. My second argument is around institutions. The rules-based institutions that were created are completely flawed. The Bretton Woods institutions were created after World War II. They were created in the West for the right reasons, to make a more stable and peaceful world. If you asked anyone in the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, IMF, WTO, would you reform them or keep them the same? They would rip them up and they would start again for a new world order, because we are living in a very different world to where we were 80 to 90 years ago. But we're not going to do this. It's not in our interest. We created the rule-based order. We now use it and weaponize it in many ways to maintain dominance. So China has had some very sharp elbows pushing their way to the table. And instead of criticizing China for their non-compliance, we could actually look to reform it, but we will not do that. And this brings me to my final point for this evening. I think this is probably the question that we all need to take away. A very serious question. Do we only want to engage and work with our geopolitical allies? And if so, who are they? Does the UK need to choose between the US and China? Does the UK need to choose between the US and the European Union? We are now moving into economic dependencies and double standards. The reality to the perception is very, very important here. China has become, like it or accept it or not, the manufacturing hub for the Western world. We made that conscious decision. We outsourced all our production, all our manufacturing to China. Why? It's cheaper, it's easier. We didn't want to do these low-skilled jobs. And I think that's also the point. When we did that, we also knew China had lower labor conditions, poor environmental practices, human rights violations, carbon emissions. We knew this. And largely we didn't care because we had selective outrage. We directly benefited while simultaneously condemning. So in many ways, we thought we were better than China. We thought we were in control of China. And in many ways we were. 20 to 30 years ago, the United Kingdom alone had an economy twice the size of China. They could never rival us. And they could never rival the United States of America, the hegemon that is the United States of America. And I think all of this economic dependency can be traced back to 2001, when we allowed China into the World Trade Organization. We said, look, here's capitalism, you'll be opened up to democracy. That never happened. In the short term, it worked, but in the long term, it didn't. And the reason why? Because China went and did something outrageous. They went and did something disgusting. They went and said, we're going to look after our own country. I know, terrible, right? We want to look after our own people. We want to do things our own way. Just unacceptable to the West. Go ahead. Thank you. So I think it's very clear that we have selective outrage. Just yesterday, we hosted a state banquet for Qatar. Next month, our business secretary will be traveling to Saudi Arabia for a growth at all costs business trip. And in many ways, this has now become pragmatic. This is imperfect. This is now the reality of geopolitics. This is now the reality of Western politics. Morally, we tell China that they are wrong, yet we continuously do the opposite. China's actions are absolutely not insulated from criticism, but just because the West is imperfect, two wrongs do not make a right. So here we are now, in 2024. We're about to move into probably the most unstable geopolitical period of my lifetime that I've ever experienced. Almost every single Western nation is reversing their trade policy. They're engaging in economic protectionism. They frame it as national security, economic sovereignty, securonomics. Yet when China does that, it's labeled aggressive and unfair. The big question that we have never asked our businesses: put your national security and the red lines, whatever that might mean, above your profits. We've never done that to business, and every single country is asking that question. So in closing, this has been an incredible honor for me to be on this stage this evening. I'm actually from Cambridge, although I am not from the university. I'm glad I got that out at the end. I used to drink at a pub around the corner, so it's very nice to finally be in this chamber. But what is very important, it is absolutely critical, that we host robust discussions and robust debates exactly like this, exactly here, to discuss the ideas that shape democracy. So while I do think the West's criticism of China is hypocritical, hypocrisy is now unavoidable. This is the feature of global politics. Nations act in their interests, in their strategies, and they have double standards. The West is the moral equivalent of me lying on the couch watching Liverpool. Thank you.